Good afternoon, everyone. We are here for the commencement lecture by Ila Patnaik, ma'am. First, I would like to invite Professor Sudarshan, the Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, to introduce our guest.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. This is a lecture in a very important series in our university, the 10th anniversary Jindal Global Lecture Series. And we are very gratified that Dr. Ila Patnaik has agreed to give this lecture. Not very recently we had Professor Dipankar Gupta speak at this forum. That was the previous lecture in the series. The Vice Chancellor will tell us a little more about the significance of our 10th anniversary and why this is a very important milestone in the career of our university. I'll limit myself to introducing Professor Ila Patnaik, who's in the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. But she's very special in a way, and I commend all the students in my school and in the other schools to take something that has been coined as a term, which is Ilanomics, quite seriously. The media would, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister and in office, or even before when he was Finance Minister, use the expression Manmohanomics. Now that's a mouthful and doesn't quite convey the clarity that Ilanomics does. And that's a very appropriate appellation, I think, because if you watch her YouTube talks and read her essays that are published regularly in the print, you'll find that it's absolute clarity on issues that seem rather confusing or complex, and issues on which our media generally gets things wrong. One of the drawbacks and limitations in Indian media, which the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication will soon set right in a matter of years, is a grasp of public policy issues. So they are generally confused and distorted. So it takes someone who's a scholar who does serious research, but is also able to communicate to the general public about these issues. Where does the Reserve Bank of India get its profits? Now, this is not a question that the average journalist, even in an economics newspaper, would be readily be able to answer. So I think we are very lucky to have Ila Patnaik give a very important lecture in the series. She's also worked in ICRIER, the Indian Council for International Economic Relations, and in NCAER. So these are think tanks, and very recently a colleague of mine, a couple of days ago, organized, that is Milindo Chakrabarti, organized through RIS, a series on University Think Tank Connect. And I think it's auspicious that we have Ila Patnaik, because I think we must begin to explore this idea of University Think Tank Connect and do more in terms of working together, getting our students into think tanks, learning how to do very quick research for policy purposes, all of that. So I'll welcome you to our faculty, and I request the Vice Chancellor to say a few words.
All right, very good afternoon to all of you. It is indeed my proud privilege to welcome Professor Ila Patnaik. As Sudarshan said, that she's one of the most thoughtful academics, public intellectuals who has straddled between the world of policy and academia for many years. And one of the remarkable things about Ela is the fact that she not only speaks truth to power, but also helps people who work in the exercise the power to act responsibly. And that's an important talent and a deep commitment towards public policy and issues surrounding governance. So we're very, very fortunate that Professor Ela Patnaik had accepted our invitation to deliver one of the public lectures, but most importantly, as Dean Sudarshan said, that the 10th anniversary public lecture is very special for us as the university marks 30th September to be our 10th anniversary. We have created a series of public lectures and we have traveled the distance of having the 6th lecture, 4 more to go before 30th September. But we've also identified individuals who have made remarkable contributions to the respective fields and who are also whose contributions do not limit to a particular field. Ela's work is also very interdisciplinary, and so once again I must say that there are very few people who are like her, who could do what she does so effectively and also communicates in a manner that students like all of you who are here can relate to. So I have always wanted her to come here, although she has been a big champion of our university and knew the evolution of this university for a very long time. But I am glad it has happened at the 10th anniversary. So with those words, I'm going to invite Professor Ela Patnaik to deliver the 10th anniversary lecture on, and she's going to speak on the state of the Indian economy, great expectations and missed opportunities.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I've been waiting for this invitation for many years. It was promised to me long ago. And I am very glad to see so many young people here, and I hope that we can have a useful discussion. I'm going to speak for a short while and then take lots of questions so that I'm sure, we can't cover the state of the Indian economy in an hour or an hour and a half. So it will be better that after my introduction, I leave it to you to ask questions about what's most interesting or puzzling to you. So let me begin with the puzzle. You'll hear people say that India is the fastest growing economy in the world. Yeah? So our labor force, infrastructure. You'll also hear people say we are in the midst of a recession, government has to do something to pull us out of the recession. Any of you who read the pink papers particularly will, or even watch TV debates, will be hearing how the economy has slowed down, things are very bad until last week. I mean, today the markets have picked up, but until last week, markets have been going down. So can I ask, how many of you think the first statement is correct, that India is growing really fast, is one of the fastest growing economies of the world? And, so we have nothing much to worry about? Okay, one. Two. How many of you think the second statement is true? Okay. Okay, so the economy is slowing down. And how many of you think that both statements are true? Yes. So actually, yes, both statements are true. And the question is, how can both statements be true? To answer that question, let's just step back into history in trying to understand what is it that helps us understand whether an economy is growing fast or whether it is growing slow. Business cycle research started sometime in the first half of around the mid-1940s or so, and it started studying US business cycles, where it was seen that the US economy was slowing down very sharply. So the study of business cycles, which was particularly been in advanced economies, not so much in emerging economies like ours, would say that, okay, if the economy is producing below potential, Okay? And the buzzword here is the potential output. So if it is below its potential, that means there is inadequate demand, capacity is not being fully utilized, then it is in the midst of or is witnessing a business cycle downturn. Okay. Now here, remember, I'm repeating that the critical phases is the economy at its full potential. If not, there is an output gap. And this output gap was primarily understood as something arising from a lack of adequate demand. So business cycles in advanced economies would be characterized typically as periods of, and this is a rule of thumb, but as periods of 2 successive quarters of negative growth. Okay? So if the economy contracted for 2 quarters, that means roughly 6 months, it was actually contracting. No. So remember when I asked you the question, I said, is it growing and is it slowing down? And I did not ask whether the economy was actually contracting. Okay? And I'm going to make this distinction between an economy that is decelerating or slowing down versus one that is contracting. So in advanced economies, a business cycle downturn or a recession was understood to be a period where the economy was actually contracting, and roughly if it was contracting for 2 successive quarters, that would be that it is in a business cycle downturn. Now, given that that is where most of us started studying business cycles and trying to understand how the Indian economy is doing, whereas our theory and the books and the textbooks we read were from advanced economies, things are confusing. Right? Things are confusing because we are slowing down. We are not contracting. We are not typically an economy that is in the midst of a business cycle downturn or a recession as understood by the Michelin Burns and the NBER and the whole business cycle literature that has been with us since the 1940s. So what we've been doing, my work on this has been all the way from 1996 when we hardly had any business cycles, but trying to understand what was happening in India. There were periods of slowdown. In this period from when one has been studying this over the last 20 years, other emerging economies have also witnessed such episodes where they have been slowing down. And so they have witnessed periods of slowdown and then higher growth. But this is not contractions. Okay? Is everyone with me? By the way, if you have questions, you can even, clarifications, you can stop me in between also. I don't mind, and if you don't mind, okay, because I don't want to be racing ahead and talking over your heads. So please just raise your hand, and if it's a short question, I'll answer it then. If it's a longer question, we can take it towards the end. Okay, so what was understood was that there is a difference between a business cycle in an advanced economy versus business cycles that are being witnessed by emerging economies like ours. While for advanced economies, business cycles meant that you had periods of actual contraction of the economy, but for emerging economies, what you witnessed was cycle around a trend. So that if I think of a cycle around a trend, now let's talk about India. Then imagine that the Indian economy has been growing at an average of say 5.5 or 6%, let's say 6%. Now the 6% has been a sort of average growth, but if I look at the actual growth rates, there have been periods when it has gone up to 7, 8%, even 8.5%. And then there are periods when it has slowed down to 4.5%. What we are witnessing, and we do all the econometric analysis and the filtration and everything. So, this is not a technical lecture, but any of the econ students who are interested in that, we can talk about that later. But what you see, essentially the key characteristics that you see in India and in other emerging economies is that we witness a cycle around a trend. So that instead of a downturn or a recession being a period of actual contraction of the economy, these are simply periods of slowdown. Okay? So the economy decelerates and then it picks up. So the first derivative is always positive. The second derivative may be negative or positive depending on where you are on the cycle. Okay? So we have seen roughly about 3 business cycles in India so far. Why do I say I am using the word so far? The first the literature on cycles tried to identify business cycles till the 1990s, and these were not really business cycles. These were not periods of sustained slowing and then sustained picking up like a sine curve. Everyone familiar with sine curves? You've all done your physics and maths in school, yeah. So these were not periods like sine curves. They were more of, you had a bad monsoon, an oil shock, and the economy would suddenly have negative growth, and then next year it would pick up very sharply. So they were not really business cycles. And if you think about it for 2 minutes, it is not surprising. Why is it not surprising? Because the economy was a planned economy. Because there was no market which was responding to situations of, should I invest? Is there optimism in the market? Is demand going to increase? Do I have excess capacity? Should I stop investing? That was not the situation, and since it was before all of you were born, so I'm going to describe it just for 2 minutes because it's not going to be very interesting for you. But we had an economy which was a planned economy till 1991, which meant that really it was decided that this time so much is the investment and so much is the production. That used to be decided by the Planning Commission. It was not something that was left to the market. So there were no cycles in the economy like that. Since 1991, we've had these 3 business cycles. So, when there was a reform in 91, market forces started determining investment and production for the first time. And there was initially 91, 92, it was slow, then there was a pickup, 95, 96, we see the peak of a cycle. So business cycle has troughs when things are bad at the bottom. And really, I'm going to use the same terminology which is used for advanced economies. For emerging economies, all you have to do mentally is that when you think of a trend line and you think of a cycle around the trend, you basically think of it like this, horizontally. So then all the old examples of the peak and the trough and the sine curve start making sense as they would in an advanced economy. Okay, so you just flatten the line from the 5 or 6% to 0, and then think about, we had a trough of the cycle in about 91, 92. The economy then picked up, peaked in 95, 96, went down again, picked up a little in 99, went down again because of the Asian crisis and Y2K. And then there was a period of a long expansion till the global financial crisis, till about 2008 or so. Then it went down, and then India had a very, very expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. So the way to tackle cycles, business cycles, in India and abroad are typically, you have 2 instruments. These are fiscal policy and monetary policy. As I mentioned before, the reason for having a recession is low demand. So if that's your diagnosis, then the prescription is to increase demand, right? Where does demand come from? There are eco students here, can I ask questions? Yeah. So what are the main drivers of demand in an economy? One person. Consumption and investment, government expenditure and net exports. Yeah. So basically the drivers of demand for an economy are net exports, exports by net imports. So it could be foreign demand, it could be investment could be public or private, be government spending or consumption. Consumption is usually sluggish, exports depends on the rest of the world. What can the government do? The government can push its spending, so it can do fiscal policy. So if these are your drivers of demand, then if demand is slow, what can you do? You can push fiscal, you can do monetary policy, that pushes up maybe a bit of investment and consumption, and if that gives you a depreciation, then it can also push up exports. Okay? So typically when you are facing a business cycle slowdown or a recession, you try to have counter-cyclical macro policies. So macro policies that counter the cycle. So if demand is slow, you counter the cycle by increasing it, and you increase it by using fiscal policy or monetary policy. And in monetary policy, I include exchange rate policy. So it could be that you're trying for a depreciation, so that pushes up export demand. So broadly, those are the instruments in your hand. So in 11-12, we managed to push up our fiscal demand by, from 2008, the global financial crisis, to about 2011-12. We managed to push up demand by expansionary fiscal policy. We went up to 6% fiscal deficit to GDP, and very expansionary monetary policy, which we kept cutting rates. The RBI kept cutting rates. Now, after 2011-12, actually, investment has been on a slow decline. And we are where what one would call, in our context, in an emerging economy setting, a recessionary phase of the business cycle. So it's not something that I'm attributing to this budget, as the media sometimes would. It's not something I'm attributing to this government or the previous government. The shock that hit us in 2007-8 was, that shock had come after a long, slow phase of overheating of the economy actually. It had been growing very fast. I can at least address the faculty here because the students wouldn't remember, but there was a picture of a tiger on the Economist, that this is how fast India is growing. So we were in a phase of overheating till about 08-09. And then after the global financial crisis, there was a period when we managed to keep demand up. But since 2011-12, we have been in a period of a cyclical slowdown. The most important driver of growth in the economy has been, in the past, if I go back to looking at the full 2000s, starting from about 2000, then that has been private corporate investment. Private corporate investment rose from about 8% of GDP to about 15-16% of GDP in the first half of the 2000s, but after that it has been declining. So the most important driver of growth, India was not an export-led growth model. Consumption is not something that sees sharp swings. The government has limited fiscal space. So what we had was pretty much private corporate investment that had been growing. Now, there's a long story which I don't know that I have time for. Maybe I'll just in very short talk about this long story, but what was happening was that a lot of the investment was going into infrastructure projects. This infrastructure was being financed by bank financing. Now, if you think of a bank, everybody here has a bank account. Any bank allows you to withdraw money at any point of time. Even if it's a fixed deposit, you can break the fixed deposit. Okay? So bank deposits have short maturity. Even if it is a fixed deposit which you don't break, and you want to take that as, okay, people are going to stick to that. That also is maybe 5 years. Okay? But infrastructure projects have lives of 20, 30 years. So a lot of the funding came from infrastructure projects. There were various delays in infrastructure projects, environmental clearances, this, that and the other. And these delays meant that all those loans started going bad. The borrowers or the infrastructure companies that had borrowed under that time, the model had changed from the government spending money to public-private partnership, where the private sector or infrastructure companies were borrowing money. Those loans pretty much, about 40% of those loans went bad. When those loans went bad, the banking system came under crisis. So the sharp growth that we had seen in the first half of the 2000s was partly what was responsible for the decline in the later period, and that problem stays with us today. The question then is, what are the ways out? Should we be still thinking of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies? Should we be thinking of other things? Is it that now it's no longer about demand being less than, demand still is less and there is still unutilized capacity, but is that going to solve our problems? Now, the view that has been emerging, so while we are doing everything on demand, if you've watched the RBI cut rates, it's been aggressively cutting rates and trying to stimulate demand. The government, while it says that its fiscal deficit is 3.4% of GDP, but actually, if you look at its off-budget borrowings, then it is pretty much borrowing about 6% of GDP. Okay? The government and public sector enterprises, including food corporation, power grid, and the other. So it doesn't have too much space and not much is happening. So the question then is, what should be done? Many people are arguing, many economists are arguing that what is needed now is not merely counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy, but the Indian economy now needs structural reforms. Okay, before I go on, what are structural reforms? Anyone wants to answer? You've heard the term often enough? Yes? Yes or no? Yes, raise your hand. No, raise your hands. Then that's easier. So 2 people haven't heard the term. Everybody else has 3, 4. Okay. 5, 6 people haven't heard the word structural reforms. Everybody else has heard people use the term structural reforms. What does it mean? Go on.
Changing the framework of the whole policy or the whole economy.
Yeah. So changing the framework, changing the way the economy is organized, changing the share of allocation, the sectoral shares, changing ownership, and changing the way things are done. So an example of a structural reform would be in 1991, what we saw was a removal of import licensing and industrial licensing. Okay, that's an example of a structural reform. The structure was earlier that the planning commission would decide how much you're going to produce, then they would give a license and you would produce that much. Once you changed that, you undertook a structural reform of the economy. You allowed people to invest and to produce as much as they thought they'll be able to sell or make profits with. And where the problem actually, and the reason why people are talking about structural reforms is because while we started that process in 1991, we did not carry it all the way through. So in 1991, we did product market reforms. You can produce as much output as you want. You can stop producing as much output as you want. What you did not do is factor market reform. What are the factors of production? Land, labor, capital. So think about it. While you allowed people to change how much output they produce, you did not allow them too much freedom. You changed nothing on the factors of production. So labor laws were not changed. People till today are talking about if someone wants to shut down a factory, that's not easy. So it's like a half reform. It's like reform was partial. It was not taken to the next level. One of the capital. One of the most important elements of an economy is capital. The role of capital is to allocate resources to where they are most productive. It's like the brain of an economy. So there are savers, households save, and there are producers who either raise money through the equity market or they raise money through debt. So they go and borrow. And between the savers and the investors is the financial sector, or as I call it, capital, which needs to be allocated. So while there are people who have saved, these are not the people who are going to directly go and buy factories. They don't know enough about them. I mean, if instead of putting money in SBI, if you were to ask me to go and find out which steel mill I'm going to buy, I won't have a clue. I won't understand how the mill is working, whether it is productive, whether it is not. The role of resource allocation is the role of the financial sector, which is why it is the brain of the economy. But what we did not do was to reform the financial sector. So like labor, land, you've all heard stories about the Land Acquisition Act. Similarly, the financial sector was one of the most critical areas that were not reformed in the 91 crisis. So what did you do? You had a competitive real economy, but the financial sector was non-competitive. You still had public sector banks, and public sector banks basically, if I can be rude, it is basically politicians retaining control over who gets saving, who gets money. So politicians decide, so-and-so has to be given a loan. So this has two main difficulties. One, that of course loans get given to where they are not most productive, go bad, year after year. We use the word recapitalize. The other countries call it bailing in or bailing out. Taxpayer bails out these banks, but that's only a small part of the problem. Even though that money runs into 2.1 trillion last year and about 70,000 crores is being done this year. But that is a small part of the problem. The bigger part of the problem is that resources go to those uses which are not the most productive. And that is the kind of structural reform that we haven't done. So we still have resources. Largely, at least, the banking sector dominates the financial sector. There is a bond market, but a very small, not liquid, not deep bond market. We haven't done bond market reforms. Even in the banking sector, we haven't got a competitive banking sector. So there can be various ways one could have done those reforms. One could have privatized banks, public sector banks, or if that was politically very difficult, you could have had the telecom model or the aviation model where you allowed entry of private players and they then gained market share. Regardless of what model you followed, basically where we held back was in creating a competitive banking sector and a competitive financial sector. As a consequence, what you have today is not just a cyclical downturn, but what you have today is a structural problem. And the kind of reforms that are needed are structural reforms. So we have an economy that has been growing, that has been, let's say if it's growing at an average rate of 7%, then it has been doubling every 10 years. But the institutions that are required for that kind of growth have not been reformed. Should I stop there and take questions, or do you want me to continue? I've got 20 examples of structural changes, but depending on you choose. Yeah, so shall we just take questions from you?
Maybe you can do a bit of expectations. Great expectations.
Yes, so what are our great expectations? That we, first of all, demography, that we have a demographic dividend. Land, labor and capital are the factors of production. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, our technology, right, are the most important factors of production. And India's biggest strength is that we will be the country with the youngest labor force till 2040. After that, we start aging as well. So in the next 2 decades, we are going to have the largest young labor force. Now, our expectations from this are huge, because actually this is going to be the biggest driver of the Indian economy. It is you who are going to be the biggest drivers. Each of you trying to do something is going to result in higher GDP growth. You know, producing whatever you produce, a good, a service, as part of a company, as an entrepreneur. Now, these expectations can be met if this workforce is productive, literate, skilled, educated. About 20 years ago, only about 70%, 60 to 70% of the workforce was literate. But 5 years hence, the entire workforce will be literate. Everybody. So, you know, you could say, what does literacy mean in India? If you can sign your name, you are literate. But let me just give you a small, very, very small example. If somebody cannot read on and off of a switch, okay, an illiterate person cannot fit into a modern working environment. So the basic change that we are going to see, one big change, and that is, we know it's going to happen. That is for sure, because these are children who are enrolled in school, whatever the quality of the education. However we agree or disagree with how education should be done, and you know, we all have our quibbles, and ACER reports, children can't read, can't write as much as they should be able to. But even then, from about 40% or a third of the workforce not being literate to the entire workforce being literate, means that this country is going to have a much better quality labor force. Not only the biggest, so the first is that it's going to have young people, more than any other country in the world. The second is that it's going to have a literate workforce, which is whatever the quality of our education, but which is literate. Third, even if we look at current data, we find that the number of graduates in the workforce will go up to about 33%, from about 20%. I'm not saying that every graduate is, you know, great and will have brilliant output. Yet, there's something you learn when you go to college. And that again is it's something that's going to happen. Now, that has another very important component, and that is that female literacy and female education, which was lagging behind in our very fast growth years. In the very fast growth years, actually, it was much less. But that now is matching male literacy, reaching up to male literacy as well as education levels. Of course, there are challenges. So while we have great expectations, and I'm going to only talk about the demographic dividend because that is our biggest strength and where we have the biggest expectations from. Yet there are areas of concern even in that. As I said, the quality of education is certainly an area of concern. The second, recent data showing reduction in female labor force participation is something that is emerging as a huge area of concern, that young women are dropping out of the labor force. And I would say that these are the kind of challenges in terms of quality, in terms of ensuring that women feel safe, or can go out and work and don't drop out of the labor force, that women find that it is socially acceptable for the family to let them go out and work. And it is among the educated women that you're seeing a very sharp fall. The women age group 16 to 24 are dropping out of the labor force, which points towards, there is research on that, but which points towards some of the challenges that we still face because of conservatism in the society, because of law and order conditions, because of which if half your labor force is not going to participate, or a very small part of it is going to participate, then what demographic dividend are we talking about? So we still have huge challenges, but I think there's still great expectations from this.
Well, thank you so much for that really fantastic lecture, which really brought many of us come to terms with sort of realities and also hopefully address some of the expectations. I know our students and faculty might have questions. I want to start with one question to you, is that, I'm, by the way, not an economist, I'm a lawyer by training. And what is this $5 trillion economy that our Prime Minister keeps talking about? And what are the chances that we will actually achieve it? And even if we achieve it, what is so great about it?
So if we are today at about 2.7 trillion, roughly, then if we were growing at 7%, then it would take us 10 years to double. But if we were growing at 7% real in dollar terms, so when we're talking of $5 trillion, which really means that we're now talking about faster growth of about 8%. Now, I would say it is possible, but unless we do some of the things that, some of the structural reforms that we need to do, it may not happen. Then we may be, in a bit of a slowdown, growing at 6.5, and not be able to reach the $5 trillion mark. Why is it important? Primarily because, for poverty reduction, you need growth. The first phase of this government, and I'm going to link it back to the fact that the Prime Minister is saying it, is that the first Modi 1.0, let's call it that, was focused on a lot of schemes to reach out to the poorest. Perhaps the lessons from India Shining that the BJP got were that the poorest were left out. So the focus of the previous government of Modi 1.0 was Antyodaya, upliftment of the last man in the queue. So it is Ujjwala, our Prime Minister Awas Yojana, Swachh Bharat. It was really reaching out to the poor. I think towards the end it has become clear that you can't just redistribute the pie. You need size. And that is the reason I think that today there is an emphasis on the $5 trillion economy.
Thank you. All right, the floor is open. Please introduce yourself and you can shoot your question. They'll take a mic. Suno?
Hello, can you hear me now? Ma'am, first of all, thank you for your lecture. But with all due respect, ma'am, I disagree with majority of the things you say. I honestly believe the current state of Indian economy is at the worst, and it's no more than a joke. If you see the current pattern, our agriculture is in a decline. Our current employment rate is at its worst. The current number of graduates who get a job who do not get a job is at its highest. If you see, the number of foreign companies that going out to India is at its highest. The current rate of foreign exchange, it has been at the lowest in past number of years. And coming to the number of our current education system, let's not talk about it because it's no more than a joke, and I can tell you that. Right? So, and current policymakers, I do not think they are doing a good job because they're just giving us problems, not solutions. So how is it fair? How is it fair to have you as a current generation to have an expectation from our generation to make the economy better when you yourselves are not providing solutions? And what's worse, we are at an economic crisis and no one has realized it. You say that we are the fastest growing economy, but we are not. We have lost our economy. We have lost the top spot in the as the fastest economy growing. China is right now has growth rate 6.6%. We were at 7.6. We were at this point of time 4 years back. We were at 7.2%. Right now it's 5.8%. The way it's going to be around 3.84% within the next 3 years. I can challenge you that. So how is it?
Got you. Thank you so much for that. We'll take a few more questions. Right, please, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give her a mic here? The two mics here. Table mics. Udhar.
Stand up.
Then only people will know.
Glad to see you.
Hello, ma'am. So, this one question that was coming again and again to me is, you mentioned that the reform started in 1991, and since then we have had 3 cycles. So, and also other than product output reforms, we haven't had input reforms and financial reforms. Why exactly do you think that has happened, or why exactly do you think that has not happened? And my next question is, you mentioned that banks don't have a competitive model right now, but we do have private banks, HDFC and others. So what is their role in like reducing the hold of politicians over who gets what?
One more there. Yeah. Somebody
Hello, ma'am.
Somebody has the mic there. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am.
Stand up, please. Those who want to ask the questions, please stand up. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. So my question to you is about land reforms. You talked about, so I want to talk to you about the pattern of land holdings, right? So we know for a fact that majority of the farmland holding in India is marginal. And of course, the role of women in terms of ownership of land is also minimal. So my question is, why has there been this consistent policy paralysis when it comes to changing the pattern of land holding? We talk about removing people, taking people out of agriculture and maybe reskilling them. But there's also that immediate problem we face with, having to waive farm loans. A quick solution to the agrarian crisis we face year after year is to offer farm loan waivers. But why has there been this paralysis when it comes to looking at the long term and making the necessary structural changes, like you said, in how agricultural land is owned and utilized?
Got you. we'll just have one more. And
Yeah,
then-
thank you for this opportunity. I agree with almost everything you've said, but I also agree a lot with the student who asked the first question. We have seen declining exports, stagnant exports, we've seen declining gross fixed capital formation, all of those parameters, consumption also, government has, as you rightly pointed out, in fact, the actual fiscal deficit combined with the states and the center together is almost 9%, 8.9%. So there's no room there. And we know that there is a large number of educated people coming up without jobs. So on all accounts, the government is facing pressure. And usually the track record in India is that reforms only happen when there is a big enough crisis. We saw this in 91, even to some extent we saw this under Vajpayee, the economy was slowing down, something had to be done. So do you think this current crisis, this current cyclical downturn is deep enough, is going to be, from the indicators that you're watching, for there to be structural pressure, enough pressure for structural reform?
Shall I answer? Okay.
Please.
So I'll start with that. I hope so. Okay. Absolutely hope so. So one of the things, I think everybody has fundamentally asked one question, and that is, why are we not seeing these structural reforms? Am I right? So your gloom and doom, structural reforms in agriculture, structural reforms. So we've got 2, 3, 4 private banks. We're barely giving 2 bank licenses in 10, 15 years. So we need to do much more structural reform. And the question is, why is structural reform not happening? Now, it's a very, very difficult question to answer, because while it makes sense to everybody that this is what needs to be done. So start with something like the Land Acquisition Act that the 2014 government initially brought in. It made sense that you need land for better allocation of resources. Yet the government withdrew the bill. When it comes to the financial sector, I was principal economic advisor at the Ministry of Finance from 2014 till end of 15, and we worked on the Public Debt Management Agency bill, which was primarily to build a bond market. Withdrawn. They're tabled in Parliament, and then there was opposition, and the bill was withdrawn. N number of things. We know that there are subsidies that should not be given, but they continue to be given. That's also part of the problem. There are things that are Air India, eating up resources. Obviously something that, why is the taxpayer paying for it? So this is a very, very difficult question, that while it is fairly obvious to everybody, and I think there will be nobody here who will disagree. Now what we may disagree on is which is the reform that might be needed, but we broadly all would agree that there are fundamental reforms that need to be done. And why do governments not do them? Now, why do politicians do certain things and don't do certain things? So that's one part of the problem, that if, I'll give you one example of, again, because I work in the financial sector, I'll give you one example of a reform that was on the table and again withdrawn. So in addition to building a bond market, which was withdrawn, there was another bill that was the FRDI bill, Financial Resolution and Deposit Insurance Corporation. The idea was that if you give private banks licenses and the banks fail, what you need to have is a mechanism that the customer is taken care of. There were rumors that were floated about how that was out to destroy public sector banks, and the government, and there was some bail-in. A lot of false rumors were floated, and the bill was withdrawn. So I feel that one part of the story is that politicians want to do things that are seen to be obviously helping voters, whereas a lot of this slow, painful, not very clear when it will help and how it will help, those sort of reforms get pushed back. And I've very much been party to these two, working with these two bills, which were actually part of the reform in the financial sector that were needed but which were rolled back. The other element of the story, and that's again my opinion, personal opinion from my experience at the ministry, is that many times there is inadequate capacity in government. So when things are a stroke of the pen reform, so inflation targeting central bank, just stroke of the pen. It was easy. Once it was done, that act was passed, it was put in place. In contrast, look at the IBC, the bankruptcy, insolvency and bankruptcy code. You have to have, the system has to work. The NCLT, the tribunal has to actually work. It has to have capacity, it has to have judges, it has to have these resolution professionals, the RPs who should have knowledge and capacity to work. The system needs a committee of creditors which are basically these public sector banks. They have to, in this process, what happens is that there's a loan that has gone bad, that they are supposed to say, okay, I'll take a haircut. No public sector bank official is willing to sign off on a haircut. So you have these problems that are not like a stroke of the pen reform, but these are problems that need a lot of hard work and capacity, which I think the Indian state lacks. And that is why then you try to do quick fixes. Your quick fix was demonetized. Exactly. So you say, okay, I've got this one magic pill, it will solve all the problems. It will solve black money, it will solve digital, it will solve terrorism, it will solve counterfeiting, it will solve everything.
Money laundering.
Money laundering, and basically it will solve everything. And then it solved nothing. Okay? Because you were looking for that magic pill. A lot of it, so that's lack of state capacity. I think a lot of the time what is also happening is that politicians are thinking, and bureaucrats, because a lot of the bureaucracy is very, very powerful in working on these things, is that under my watch, nothing should go bad. So I kick the can down the road. Okay? And then after that, dekhi jayegi. So it's, you just try to solve the problem for a short while, because, and I'm not going to go into, next time you have a political scientist, you ask them how to get out of this issue. That's not my domain. But I think a lot of the times what is happening is that the politicians are just looking at a short time horizon, just do it. I mean, otherwise, I see no reason why the PDMA bill should have been withdrawn, the FRDI bill should have been withdrawn, the Land Acquisition Act bill should have been withdrawn, and instead we did demonetization.
Yeah, please. We'll take one more round. Yeah, last person.
Yeah, hello, ma'am. I wanted to know your opinion on how.
Can you stand up, please? Thank you.
How far do you think the consolidation of public sector banks can help the financial sector?
Can I answer that first? Why do you think it will help?
I want to say, because there are many, so what is seen in the literature is that mergers have not been proven very profitable even for the private sector.
So why would consolidation help at all? That's my question to you. I mean, you're saying how much will it help? I'm saying, why should it help at all?
That's what I didn't want to say how much it like. I want to ask your opinion. Do you think is it helpful because the government is very pushing laws?
I just wanted to ask a question that our government has been reforming a lot of policies regarding the manufacturing sector. I mean, we have been making India policy and everything, but then even though the manufacturing sector has not increased as much as expected, but the financial sector has increased. I mean, I've read the Economic Times article that the financial sector is increasing, even though there's not so much of the reformation in the policies, but the manufacturing sector has not reached that expectation, but the financial sector has reached above its expectation. So could you please educate me?
I think that article is wrong. The financial sector is in a bad.
No, like the foreign investment for the financial sector has been increasing in a lot rate. Like in Mumbai, you can go through the Economic Times one. I can show you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd love to read that.
Please.
Thank you very much. Just a few brief questions. One, I mean, and this is just purely from my own personal knowledge, would you be aware of any academic work that's been carried out on the spot impact of the 2013 Land Acquisition Act, which fundamentally changes how you could acquire land in India, and its impact on the probability of large infrastructure projects failing? Because there seems to be a very widespread perception in public sector, bank, higher level management that that was a particular policy intervention that made such large projects very unviable. So that would be one. The second one is that this very curious thing that as opposed to other Asian economies, the Indian economy has been on a downward track of personal savings. So savings rates have actually gone down from 2010 onwards to in fact to this day, which is very counterintuitive because you would expect that as the real economy of a country increases, and as per capita income increases, a larger proportion would be available for savings that can then be recycled. So despite the failings of the financial sector, is there also an input problem into the financial sector that not enough, let's say people are not saving enough? And a very short final comment, so I just read an article today morning that the Committee on Direct Tax Changes had just submitted its report and some details are trickling out. And one of the suggestions is a drastic reduction in the highest marginal tax rate from 30 to 20%. And if you think that that would have some role to play in alleviating at least some of the immediate issues that we face.
Okay, so first, no, I don't really know of studies. My work on financial sector mainly, so I don't know what studies on land acquisition, if there is any research. On savings, it's a real puzzle because what we are seeing in the data is almost a sharp decline in household savings rate. From 2016, it could be that is happening because of enterprises' savings going down. Enterprises, particularly small household, informal sector, cash-based enterprises, were hit because of demonetization. So after 16, there is a reason we can find a cause, but not so much in the 12 to 16 period, and it's a puzzle. So I don't have an answer for that. But it would be very good if somebody was to focus on that and work on it because it remains a puzzle. On the third, see, other countries, including China and many of the other emerging economies, started bringing down their corporate tax rate about 15 to 20 years ago. The average corporate tax rate is 15% in those countries. In India, the effective corporate tax rate is 19%. That's the effective rate. The effective rate means that a lot of exemptions are given and the marginal rate is 30 plus, so 33% effectively. In addition to the 33, there is a dividend distribution tax as well. So at net, the tax on profits comes to about 51%. So the committee in its deliberations has, I don't know what is leaked out, but I know the report. So the committee in its deliberations felt that what you need to do is one, remove exemptions because that gives a lot of discretionary powers to tax officials who often misuse that discretionary power. I mean, we hear stories of corruption. I think even this morning, 20 officials have been prematurely retired. So to reduce that discretionary power, remove exemptions and reduce the corporate tax rate to 20%. So that is the framework in which they are recommending that. Will it help? Will it help in increasing investment? So if you look at trends of Indian companies who are doing outbound FDI, who are going and investing in lower tax destinations, not the tax havens, but say going to China, for example, and investing there, then it does It's not very clear. So I've got some research on that. It's not entirely clear till now from the data that lower tax is one of the big reasons for them to go out. But let's wait and see. That could be part of what's happening.
Right, a couple of questions last.
If you allow me, I'm completely ignorant about the Indian economy, and you've taught me a lot. But if I understand correctly, you're drawing our attention to the missed opportunities of structural reform that will allow the Indian economy to achieve its great expectations in terms of what? In terms of gearing land, labor, and capital towards greater productivity, so that growth will continue to be the greatest in the world. But the question that I'm sure you thought about and that I don't understand is growth of what? Growth of consumer products to imitate the industrialized countries? Growth of energy production that is contaminating the planet? Growth of productivity that is not sustainable in the long term for the planet? I'm sure you factor these matters in, but what frightens me is that if the missed opportunities are captured for greater investment to achieve greater growth, that growth might very well be harmful to the survival of India and the rest of the planet. Is that factored into the economic analysis? Thank you.
If you are assuming that I'm talking about large-scale, Chinese-type, highly polluting industries which are full of blue-collar workers and churning out stuff into our rivers, no. In fact, if I had had the time, I would have talked a lot more about how the reason we need a competitive banking sector, something that has not happened, is because banks are best placed to give loans to small enterprises. They are the best place to see whether a company has the potential to develop or not. Small enterprises, I'm not talking about the big polluting enterprises, but the small enterprises who could well be producing something local, something which is needed for the regional economy, something that is green, environment friendly, disaster risk resilient, climate change resilient, and it is far more, the stock markets don't give us that kind of, because there's too much asymmetric information. The stock markets can't do that. In fact, what I would do is take your question back to your question as well, which is that when you have local banks, if we had given permission for local banks, not PSUs to whom we give mandates to give mudra loans. That's what we are currently doing. I don't know if you're familiar with mudra loans, but these are loans that we say, these are the 3 categories of loans and you have to give them. And then they try and basically rejig current loans and call them mudra loans, which is what a lot of what has been happening. But actually have banks, could be local savers, but who give loans to small enterprises. Today, only 4.6% of loans to MSMEs come from the formal sector. If you want to, sell flowers, you want to set up a small shop to sell flowers, you won't get a loan. You'll get a loan at 29 or 30%, because there's nobody in the formal sector who has the mandate to give you a loan. Because the way the public sector, our missed opportunities of reform have been that we have actually not done the reform that would have given an adequate competition in the banking sector, that they would find your small flower shop, and which is environment friendly. They would find it worthy. They would find you producing value. Not, I don't know, you might call it consumerism, but I would say that if the local community buys flowers and becomes happy, then that is very much something that's the kind of growth we would like to see. So I think the missed opportunities are much more in terms of things that would have helped. So India is very, very diverse, and we have tried to find these one-size-fit-all models, these big banks who are then told. Somebody told me a story recently that the minimum size of a mudra loan is 50,000. I used to think that 50,000 is actually too small. And I'd read people in the Economic Times and here and there saying how many people can you employ in 50,000? You can only pay one person or something. And that used to be the logic. So I met this woman who's doing, she has a company where they try to give small loans to women. And her story was that actually women need only 25,000 to buy 3 sewing machines and set up a tailoring shop. And instead, we are forcing them to take 50,000. So what then happens is that they go and use either they buy 6 machines and then they don't have the management capacity, and the local demand is not enough to make so many, to stitch so many clothes. So then the business goes down and the loan turns NPA. Or she buys 3 machines and then she uses the other 25,000 for consumption, which again means the loan turns NPA. So by not having a competitive banking system, but by forcing banks, giving them this mandate, regardless of what the need is, regardless of where you are located, regardless of what you want to do, the minimum size of the loan is 50,000. That sort of central planning is, I think, what is hurting us.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. Just a couple of points, and it was wonderful and very insightful talk. I think more important, it's very difficult to encapsulate everything when we have a little bit of time. I just felt that probably this over pessimism that we have generally about the Indian economy, and I do agree that it's doing relatively well in comparison to a lot of countries. Just it's only when you get out of the country that you understand what's really happening elsewhere. So one of the quick points was that your work has been in business cycles and trying to look at that. One of the aspects we look at business cycles is to see them as functions of confidence cycles. In India post-90s, most investments that came in the corporate sector came in auto, the IT, construction, finance. Most of these were the areas that became the key job creators. Now what's happened is most of these sectors' growth were linked or interlinked with outside markets very clearly, and mostly in Western Europe, North America. Now what's happened post-2008 is that most of these sectors have started, sorry?
I don't agree.
Okay, all right. So maybe you could explain why. That's one of the things. The other is, if these sectors are not doing relatively that well right now, we're talking about a new direction to make those structural reforms. And one of the acronyms have been kind of rallying, and we've been trying to have a discussion, is to use water, women, agriculture, textiles, exports, and renewables. If your direction of policy is signaled towards these 5 areas, renewables because technology is there, is doing really well. Exports because border states have the capacity, they don't have the space to really integrate with the markets. Textiles because that's your commodity-based units which have done really well in response sector. So my only idea was if that could be seen as areas that we should really focus on going forward. And I would like to know why you agree that these sectors be.
Yeah, so the sectors like construction, like infrastructure, they were not dependent on exports. They were not dependent on the rest of the world. This is where we saw most growth happen, most of the investments. So you look at CapEx database, okay? So since you're an economist, I would suggest, look at CMI's CapEx data. Bulk of the investment in periods of sharp high growth, so for particularly, let's say the first half of the 2000s, was going into infrastructure. Infrastructure is not dependent on the rest of the world.
So I said construction was creating the most jobs. I was not saying that these are all interlinked with capital from outside. These became the job creating sectors in the Indian economy. Whether it was automobiles, whether it was financial sector, IT, construction, because that's where most of the contractualization happens.
So they were job creating, but it's not that they were, I thought you said they were dependent on the rest of the world. These were the sectors.
Auto and IT and most of these which were seen in services and manufacturing as those parts. What I'm saying is now you don't have job creating sectors, and if you don't look at new creators for jobs to come in,
So, I mean,
you have an entrepreneurial vacuum to talk about.
So I don't at all agree with the government picking sectors and pushing those sectors. And I mean, so this...
Women would not be a sector, madam. I mean, if you say women, if you focus on
so
education.
you put too many things in one sentence. Okay, you put women, you put textiles. So I'm just saying that even if it is policies for women, I would say the most important thing is law and order. It is not women. It is not saying Beti Bachao. It is actually doing law and order. It is better education. Education not just for women, of the men. In fact, when I give you this example that women are dropping out of the labor force, there's a paper by Tarun, he's at ISB Hyderabad. He presented it recently where he shows how a lot of the women, he did an interview and he finds that women are not participating in labor markets because their husbands are stopping them. So I think it's education of men that is more important for women labor force participation to increase. So when we try to pick sectors, when we try to pick, okay, these are the people who should grow, it's again like my Mudra loan, 50,000, okay. You know, when you try to do this sort of central planning, whether it is social central planning, whether it is industrial, whether it is, I just think that instead of that, you know, need to reduce the obstructions that you put in place. You want, I think that time is up.
No, not time is up, but I think this conversation is fantastic and I wanted to go along. But, hello. I was just reminded of, I think it was in 1992, President Bill Clinton's campaign against George Bush 1 had this extraordinary phrase which said, "It's the economy, stupid." It became a huge sort of, galvanizing force. While we are discussing this, has Prime Minister Modi successfully made a point to the economists and others, it's the politics stupid, by really not focusing on all these things that we're talking, but somehow capture the imagination of large part of India, even though the narrative, even for the 2014 elections, was many things that we are discussing about it, but that was not what the larger Indian imagination ended up becoming. So has he successfully argued and made a case for it's the politics stupid?
Well, I think he understands the pulse of the people and their aspirations better than us economists do. I mean, I would not try to compete in a space where I have no expertise.
Well, thank you so much.
Sincerely thank Pusika Patnaik for taking time out of our schedule and for delivering the 6th lecture in the 10th anniversary Jindal Global Lecture Series and for an insightful and lucid talk on the Indian economy. It couldn't have come at a more opportune time. In the last few weeks, we have been seeing the developments. In particular, if you see the today's papers, they're full of stories about RBI, how it has lent about a record dividend to the government of India, 1,76,000 crore, and while keeping a smallest reserve for itself, and then lies a big deal. And you talked about the institutional capacity, about in the end, it's all about institutions, individuals, leaderships, and there's a need to strengthen institutional capacity and also for structural reform. Thank you very much, ma'am. And I want to thank the Dean School of Government and Public Policy and students for participating in this event. Thank you.